was after a long night. And we were awoken to a knock at the back door, which would have only been one person, or two maybe. Early in the morning, it wasn't really that early, but after a long night, it was early. And my mom was there with tears in her eyes, not because she was sad, but because she was kind of aggravated, kind of mad, frustrated. Can you come? Beebah's fallen down. And Beebah was my grandmother's, my dad's mom. And she had lived a long life of picking cotton, chopping tobacco in wherever it was, Cross City, somewhere over there, in Florida. Lived a life cooking over the stove, raising chickens, just to bring to somebody at church. And she had all kinds of plants, not really because they looked pretty for the landscape, because, she would plant them in just about anything, including old garbage cans. But it was just so that she could cut some off and plant them and bring some to somebody. Church, just being at Walmart and seeing somebody and say, here's a rose. Yeah, I'll go, Mom. Of course, I'm going to go and help Beebah get up out of the yard. So I go out there, and she's sprawled out next to the driveway. Didn't know how long she'd been there. And this wasn't the first time. So before you start judging me too harshly, she knew she shouldn't have been out there. Shouldn't have been out there. So I come walking up, Beebah, what are you doing? Oh, well, I just thought I'd lay here and cool my back off. I got a smart mouth. And it wasn't until then that I knew where I got it from. Are you kidding me? You want to lay here and cool your back off? And I told her, I said, look, my mom and dad are working hard to try to keep you healthy and happy. And I said, but she can't do this anymore. She can't get you up. I just happened to be home this Saturday morning to come and get you up out of the yard. It may have been a Friday morning, I don't know, but I was home for whatever reason. And I said, you keep this up, and I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to call the ambulance. They're going to come and pick you up, and they're going to take you to the nursing home. And we'll pack up all your stuff, and the next trip is going to be to the dump with all these plants. Because you're not supposed to be out here. Okay. It was hard for her getting old. She always liked going out in the yard. She always liked cooking. And it wasn't because she liked eating it, because she usually wouldn't really eat what she made. It was for us. She didn't like gardening because it was pretty for her house. She liked gardening for other people. And she didn't want to just sit there and waste away. She wanted to go out with her boots on. You go back to Numbers chapter 13. We're going to look at an individual that felt the same way. He went out with his boots on, as it were. Well, we meet him first here as Moses is looking for some spies to go spy out this new land that God is going to fulfill the promise that he made to Abraham. All the way back in Genesis. 400 years have passed. 4 generations. The iniquity of the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Jebusites and all the otherites that God had told Abraham their iniquity is not yet complete. But in 4 generations, your children are going to come back and they're going to take possession of this inheritance. And so here Israel is on the banks, ready to go in. And Moses is looking for some spies. And so they call out spies from each of the tribes. And Joshua and Caleb were some of them here in Numbers 13. And he tells them, you're going to go and you're going to look and you're going to find, you're going to see what it is there. And so they went and looked and they found. In fact, they even came back, if you look through there, in chapters 13 and 14 and 15 there, it was truly a land flowing with milk and honey. In fact, it says there they cut a cluster of grapes that was so big that I don't know that it was the grapes, individual grapes, or the cluster was just so big that it took 2 men carrying it on a pole between them to get back. It was a good land. But there were giants. And I believe they were literally giants. They were really big people. And there's historical evidence, there's archaeological evidence that, yeah, there's some really big people living there. And we're not talking Jack and the Beanstalk big, where these guys were 50 feet tall or anything like that. But the Bible describes Goliath, who was of this people, as being about 9 feet tall. That's a big guy. Carrying a really heavy spear and a really heavy sword and really heavy armor, and so this was a giant. And this was a land of giants. And all the other spies said, we're like grasshoppers. We can't take over the land. Caleb, though, disagreed. We look there in verse 27 through 30, and then chapter 14, verse 6. But let's look in verse 27. Then they told him and said, we went to the land where you sent us. It truly flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. And they show him the clusters that we just talked about. Nevertheless, the people who dwell in the land are strong. The cities are fortified, and they're very large. Moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. Those would be the giants. They'll come back into play at the end of the story. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the south. The Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the mountains. And the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the banks of the Jordan. Then Caleb quieted the people before Moses. Because after this report, everybody's kind of upset. Whoa, you want us to do this? Go and conquer this land? I don't care how rich it is. There's giants there. There's kind of uproar, and Caleb quiets the people before Moses and said, let's go up at once and take possession, for we are able to overcome it. We see where Caleb's faith comes from in this passage. Not this particular verse here, but we know Caleb believes that they can be successful, even overcoming giants, because of God. God is with us. And imagine the things that Caleb has seen. Imagine the things that Israel has seen. These are the same people. We're not talking about a generation ago. We're not talking about 500 years. We're not talking about 2,000 or 3,000. We're talking about the same people who were in Egypt and saw the plagues that plagued the Egyptians. They saw those things. They saw Moses turn the Nile River to blood. They saw Moses go out and part the Red Sea. And these people were the ones that crossed over. They saw on the other side, before they crossed over the Red Sea, they saw the pillar of fire protecting them from the oncoming Egyptian army. They were the ones that were following the fire, the cloud of fire by night, and they followed the cloud by day. They saw this. They were there at Mount Sinai and saw the thunder and the lightning and the earth shake. They saw the tabernacle of the Lord filled with His Spirit. They saw the water come from the rock. And yet they're scared of these giants. Caleb says, we can overcome this. We can be successful because of God. But they were struggling with this concept of beating giants. Caleb at this point, he's 40 years old. We see that in Joshua 14, verse 7 there. And so after he stands up and makes this statement, calm down, we're going to do this. Verse 31 of Numbers chapter 13, we are not able to go up against these people, for they are stronger than we. And they gave a bad report. And so nobody wants to go. We saw the giants in verse 33, the descendants of Anak. We were like grasshoppers. And so they refused to go. Let us select a leader in chapter 14, verse 4, and return to Egypt. We would rather go back to be slaves than to face these giants. We would rather go back to being slaves and beaten not given the kind of materials that we need to be successful. Remember, Pharaoh took the straw from them and said, you still have to make just as many bricks. We'd rather go back to that than to come into this inheritance because there's giants there. Moses and Aaron are distraught. They fell on their faces before all the assembly of the congregation of the children of Israel in verse 5. But Joshua and Caleb in verse 6, they tore their clothes. And they spoke to all the congregation of the children of Israel in verse 7, saying, the land we passed through to spy is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, then he will bring us into this land and give it to us. A land which flows with milk and honey. Only not rebel against the Lord, nor fear the people of the land, for they are our bread. Their protection has departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. And all the congregation said to stone them with stones. Joshua and Caleb were just doing what they were supposed to do. Being faithful to the Lord. They knew that they could be successful. They knew that victory was theirs because of the Lord. God is going to take care of us. He's taken care of us this far, and he will give us this land. We can be successful. And as a result, their family, their friends, wanted to just stone them for speaking the truth, to being faithful to the Lord. Let's take them and stone them. But then we see there at the end of verse 10, now the glory of the Lord appeared in the tabernacle of meeting before all the children of Israel. And then we see Moses interceding for the people as God was going to wipe them out and start over. But instead he banishes them to wander around the wilderness for 40 years. While that generation died out except for Joshua and Caleb. And so they are there wandering around, and then they come back, and we see later on at the end of Deuteronomy a little bit, but really the book of Joshua, is them coming in and conquering the land, led by Joshua, mainly. But we see Caleb in there. If he's 40 at this scene when he spies out the land, he's now 80 years old. And he's there, and he fights, and he fights, and he fights, and he fights. And yet this promise that Moses had made to him, after this scene here of them standing up and defending the Lord and proclaiming their faithfulness and saying, I'm on God's side, he can protect us. Moses says, the land that you walked over and spied out, that's going to be your inheritance. It's going to be yours. The best is going to be yours. Well, Caleb fought, and he hadn't come into his possession, his inheritance. And so we see in chapter 14 of Joshua now, Caleb making his request. He's now 85 years old. And we're there in verse 10. The Lord has kept me alive, he says to Joshua, as he said, these 45 years, ever since the Lord spoke this word to Moses while Israel wandered in the wilderness. And now, here I am this day, 85 years old. As yet I am as strong this day as on the day that Moses sent me. Just as my strength was then, so it is now strength for war, both for going out and for coming in. Now therefore, in verse 12, give me this mountain of which the Lord spoke in that day. For you heard that day how the Anakim were there, and that the cities were great and fortified. It may be that the Lord will be with me, and I shall be able to drive them out, as the Lord said. Remember what that mountain was. That mountain was the home of giants. That mountain was the home of fortified cities inhabited by giants. And we have here Caleb displaying the same level of faith, maybe more, as he had his youth when he first spied out the land. And now he's 85 years old. And he says, the Lord has made me strong today as I've ever been. And if we were able to take it then the Lord will be with me now. I am just as strong now to go in and conquer this land as an inheritance. How easy it would have been for him to say, look, Moses said that I could have an inheritance, and so I'm old now, so how about I just go and find a nice plain pasture that we've already captured? I'll go and take that as a possession. I'll put in my time. I've done my due diligence. I've been a soldier for Israel, and we've come in and we've done a lot of conquering, but now let me just come back and retire. I'm tired. I'm old. Let me just take it easy. But instead, he picks a mountain that he's going to go and capture. And not just a mountain that is inhabited by normal people, but it's a mountain inhabited by giants. That's an 85-year-old soldier making this request. Caleb wasn't willing to take it easy. He wasn't willing to just sit back and fade away. He says, the Lord was on my side then, and he'll be on my side now. I'm just as strong as I ever was. Caleb was victorious through faith. He was victorious in battle because the Lord was on his side. Chapter 15 of Joshua, verse 14. This is another, I like these kind of verses that a lot of times we just sort of read over and we don't really think about it. It's just like there's some people that were killed. Not going to really pay attention to who it was. Because, when you look at it, it's usually names that you can't really read and you don't really think about who it was. But verse 14 here of Joshua chapter 15, Caleb was successful. He drove out the 3 sons of Anak. And then it gives the name of those 3 sons as being these children. So who were they? They were the biggest, they were the baddest giants. They were the biggest, baddest giants of the biggest, baddest giant. As you look through there, some of the language is kind of lost. We don't really exactly know what the Hebrew word is for this town, but it's similar to another word for giant, and this guy is the leader of the giant race. And so Caleb went in, and he was victorious over the baddest of the bad giants at 85 years old. What an inspiration. What an inspiration for the young. That Caleb could go in as an 85-year-old soldier and be victorious. What an inspiration for the old. That an old, salty soldier still has enough vinegar to go in and be victorious. This legacy of giant slaying, wanting a lot of things. He has a really good inheritance now. He is blessed with physical blessings, but maybe one of the things that Caleb, as a father, would count as a top blessing was a faithful son-in-law. Othniel, in Joshua chapter 15, verse 1, who later became a judge of Israel, a great military man in his own right, but he won a faithful son-in-law. He was an inspiration for maybe a young shepherd boy who was there in the wilderness watching the sheep as the bear and the lion come. And he's able to overcome those through God's help. And then, still a young man facing down his own giant named Goliath. And said, God is on my side and I can be victorious. Perhaps this example of Caleb as being this old soldier, not willing to just fade away and into retirement and take it easy and no longer fight for the Lord, maybe he inspired those 3 young men who were far from home. And how easy it would have been for them to just say, I'll bow down, but I'm not really bowing down. Knowing that if they just did that, then everything would be easy. But if I don't, then I'm going to be burned alive. How easy it would have been for me just this once close the windows and not pray to the way I always pray. And I could just avoid being eaten by lions. And yet we see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego facing down their own giant. And we see Daniel facing down his own giant. I'm going to do this because this is what God wants me to do. And I don't care if I'm going to be thrown into a furnace of fire, or I don't care if I'm going to be put in a pit with hungry lions. I'm going to do this. But God's on my side. And if it's His will, we'll overcome. What's the giant that you're facing? Is it the giant of knowing what is right? Knowing what is true? And maybe losing a job. Maybe losing family. Maybe losing the friends that you've known. Maybe it's losing a congregation. Are you willing to face down your giants, knowing that God's on your side, and with the attitude that it doesn't matter if I fail, I know this is right, and God's going to be on my side? That was the attitude that Caleb had. That was the attitude that David expressed when he went out to fight Goliath. And that was the attitude of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel, is that our God is able to save us. But even if He doesn't, I am going to do what He wants me to, because there is more than this life. Caleb wasn't too old to be a giant slayer. You're never too old to be a giant slayer. We see this man unwilling to fade away into history. We don't really know much about Caleb. We see Joshua sort of taking charge and taking lead. Maybe he was more suited to lead Israel than Caleb was. But we see Caleb the one standing up on that day and saying those words. Look, God is going to help us. God is going to take care of us. And it was Caleb that came to Joshua and said, let me have this. Let me go up and fight these giants, because I can still. And I'm going to use the talent that God has given me, even in my old age. It gets easier sometimes, I think, when we get older, to think that things are going to be easier. Maybe when I'm older, this kind of sin won't be a problem anymore. Maybe when I'm older, it'll be easier for me to do this or that or the other. And I think as we all get older, we can all agree that that's not the case. It wasn't easier. It wouldn't have been easier for Caleb to go and take this mountain than when it was when he was 40. And yet he was still willing to go and to conquer, because that was the job he was supposed to do. You're never too old to be faithful to God. But don't wait until you're old. Caleb didn't start being faithful. He didn't waste his youth squandering it away. We don't see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We don't see David doing those things. We see them being faithful early, and then we see them being faithful late in life as well. Don't wait to start a fight for the Lion of Judah. We see Jesus. Maybe, perhaps, Jesus knew and applied this. I'm sure he did know. I'm sure David knew. I'm sure Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego knew the story of Caleb. They would have studied this. And they allowed it to be that inspiration for them. Work like you're young again. Caleb and Joshua stood faithful with friends that were wanting them to back down. Maybe it was that they wanted to go and take and stone Joshua and Caleb because their shame was reflected back to them. They saw faithfulness shining in the faces of Joshua and Caleb. They saw that they were being bold and courageous for God, and they were being cowardly. And so they wanted to take and stone them. Whatever the reason was, they knew what that consequence could have been. How can we How can we do anything different when we're so surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses? Bob, at the end of her life, went out with her boots on. I remember one of the last things she tried to do was bake biscuits. She made handmade biscuits. She would take, and I don't even know if you could buy these things anymore, the sifter, the flour sifter, I'm sure you can. She'd sift the flour. And she had this circle pan that was so old that the thing was all warped. It wouldn't sit flat on the counter and wobble. And they didn't come out. They weren't very good. She went out as a servant. Will you do the same? Because the promise is, those who wait on the Lord, their strength will be renewed. Wait on the Lord. Trust in Him. Be faithful to the end. And the reward will be ours. The gospel invitation is always open. If you want to be a soldier for Him, won't you come as we stand and sing?